大家好。坐喺我隔離呢位呢係 Nehemia 咁好高興我哋喺耶路撒冷好偶然一個機會咧撞到佢。咁佢咧就出咗兩本書。咁第一本咧就係The Hebrew Yeshua 同埋 Greek Jesus。咁第二本書咧就係 A Prayer to Our Father。咁而第二本書咧而家正係被翻譯為中文。咁今次有呢個機會咧，咁我哋會把握呢個機會啦，問下佢幾個問題嘅。Okay, Nehemia, you can introduce yourself.
大家好, my name is Nehemia Gordon. I live here in Jerusalem, Israel. I was originally born in the United States, in Chicago. Lived in Israel since 1983.
Okay, and you studied the New Testament.
Yes, I did my bachelor's degree in biblical studies and archaeology and my master's degree in biblical studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem here. Mm-hmm. And part of my studies brought me into contact with various ancient Jewish documents. I studied the Mishnah and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I actually worked in the Dead Sea Scrolls, translating some of the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls Reader. Mm-hmm. And as part of that overall study of ancient Jewish sources, one of the sources I came across was the New Testament, the Gospel specifically, and especially the Gospel of Matthew. When you study those documents, coming from a Jewish perspective, I immediately see the Jewish background and context of those documents. Mm-hmm. And I was studying the New Testament originally just simply as a Jewish document, the way I'd study the Dead Sea Scrolls.
So the New Testament they are Jewish documents.
Right. Well, especially the Gospels were written by Jews, mm-hmm. and we know especially Matthew in particular, we're told by the ancient sources it was written by Jews for a Jewish audience in Israel, in Hebrew. And so you need to understand that Jewish context and background in order to understand what it's talking about.
It's often that I ask people whether they have read any ancient Jewish document. Christians will say no, they've never read. Because we don't think of the New Testament as ancient Jewish. Even though many manuscripts reserved for us today are in Greek, but they are Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Well, we know, as I mentioned, specifically the Gospel of Matthew, we have direct testimony from the church fathers, the early Christian authors who tell us, they say, matter of factly, the Gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew for a Jewish audience. And when you look at it in the Hebrew, when you look at it in the Greek, and you read the New Testament in Greek, again, specifically Matthew, you see what are called Hebraisms. Hebraisms are these Hebrew thought patterns that are literally translated from Hebrew into Greek, and when you read them in Greek, in the New Testament in Greek, it doesn't make any sense in Greek. And I'm sure your Chinese audience will appreciate that. I'm sure there are many expressions in English that when you literally translate into Chinese don't make any sense, and vice versa. Well, that's what you find in the New Testament, and especially in Matthew, are these Hebraisms everywhere, these Hebrew expressions literally translated. And even if the church fathers told us nothing, you would look at the Gospel of Matthew in Greek and say this had to be translated from Hebrew. Now, the fact that they confirm this is a second witness that both the text itself and the church fathers are telling us that this thing was written in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. And then from Greek it was translated into other languages. The English is usually based on the Greek, but sometimes with the intermediary of the Latin, depending which English version you're using.
I see. You wrote a book called A Prayer to Our Father.
Yes.
And this is about what Christians call the Jesus Prayer, the Lord's Prayer.
Right. It's commonly in most languages, it's actually called the Our Father Prayer. I don't know what it's called in Chinese, but if you look at most languages in the world, it's called the Our Father Prayer. In English, it's usually called the Lord's Prayer. But if you think about it, in ancient Hebrew, most books are named and prayers are named after the opening words. So the first book of the Bible is called Bereshit, which means in the beginning. That's the book of Genesis. This prayer would have been known in its day as the Avinu, as the Our Father prayer. I wrote the book Prayer to Our Father together with a Christian pastor, a man from North Carolina who is he's an African American man in the Methodist Church, and I met him over here in Jerusalem, Israel. And we had a series of encounters that we talk about in the book, and very exciting things that eventually led us into this relationship of study. And we actually started out just studying the Tanakh, just studying the Old Testament in Hebrew. My background was in the Hebrew text. He, coming from a Christian seminary, had a little bit of Hebrew, but Hebrew really for him was a reference tool. He wanted to study Hebrew the way and read it the way he read an American newspaper, to be able to read it fluently, which is what I do. When I read the Old Testament in Hebrew, I don't read the English, I just look at it in the Hebrew. We began to study together, and really with me as the teacher, and I found over time that it wasn't just me teaching him, I was learning things from him as well. He was teaching me, because he had certain insights and perspectives that I didn't have, especially looking at certain things in the prophets. And so I was helping him with the language, and he was helping me with his perspective, and together we were getting a picture of Scripture that neither one of us would have had individually by ourselves. And we had one rule, though, when we first started, and I asked him to agree to one rule, and that one rule was that as a Jew, I don't want him to come to me and try to convert me. I want, if we're going to study together the Old Testament, let's just focus on the Old Testament. So the rule was, first of all, I won't try to convert you if you don't try to convert me. And the other rule was essentially related to that, which is let's only talk about the Old Testament, no discussion of the New Testament or Jesus. And it was actually after a number of years where we were studying together that I went to him and I asked him, I said, would you study the New Testament with me? And he was shocked. He thought, well, you're the one who asked us not to study the New Testament. And the reason I asked him to study that is that I'd seen studying the Old Testament that he had a perspective I didn't have, even though I had the language expertise. I thought coming to the New Testament, he'll have so much more of a perspective, because I come at the New Testament as a textual scholar. He's coming at it as a believer. If we put those two things together, who knows what we might find. And what we did find eventually were amazing discoveries. And it's not that we sat down and said, let's study together so we can write a book. We actually just did this initially as a research project. In order to simply understand the New Testament, and specifically the Gospel of Matthew. There's this Hebrew version that I came across. I didn't discover it. It was discovered in the 1980s by an American professor from Georgia. It's called the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew. As I was studying this, I realized it would be so much more beneficial to bring his perspective into it. And what we found were amazing things. And we focused on the Lord's Prayer together, because that's the one thing that I think Christians and Jews can look to and say, here's something we can pray together. Because if you ask most Jews, they'll say, I can't pray with a Christian, because the Christians have the whole issue of praying to Jesus or in Jesus' name. If we look at the Lord's Prayer, there's something where Jesus himself, Yeshua as he was known then himself, taught people to pray. He taught Jews to pray and Christians, and it's a prayer that no Jew could say, oh, there's even a single word of that that's contrary to the Jewish faith. There's nothing in that prayer contrary to Judaism. So we thought if we focus on this, what a powerful thing that would be, because it's something that we can share in common. It's something that's a totally Jewish message. At the same time, it was Jesus who taught that Jewish message.
Okay. So from your perspective,
yes,
Jesus fit very well as a Jewish teacher.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, absolutely. When I read the teachings, particularly of Jesus, I see a Jewish teacher 2,000 years ago teaching to other Jews, speaking on Jewish issues and subjects. Like, for example, in my first book, I talked about the position that Jesus had on the whole issue of the Pharisees. Well, if you don't know what a Pharisee is, then you could not possibly understand what he's trying to say. I actually grew up as a Pharisee, a modern-day Pharisee. My father is an Orthodox rabbi to this day, and I dealt and struggled with some of the same issues that Jesus, Yeshua, was talking about 2,000 years ago. So when I read these things, I'm seeing a Jewish teacher speaking on Jewish subjects to other Jews. Later on, there's the issue that this was spread around the world, and sometimes it was misunderstood.